We're going to turn our focus to the US's plans to dial back its military presence in Africa now. Speaking at African Lion, the largest joint training exercise on the continent, General Michael Langley urged African nations to take the lead in their own security, calling for greater self-reliance in the face of growing threats. Well, the shift comes as Islamist insurgencies gain ground while Russia and China intensify their push for influence across the region. Well, let's speak more on this and speak to Paul Melly, who's a consulting fellow for the Africa Programme at Chatham House. Thanks so much for joining us on the programme, Paul. Good to see you.
You're welcome.
Just give us some context first. Lay out for us how the US contributes to Africa's security.
Well, there have really been two dimensions, if you like, to the US support for security and stability across the African continent. One is directly military. And so there have been a number of locations, I think 6,500 American troops at the moment, stationed in various places across Africa. They were, for example, very prominently based with a big drones base in Niger in the Sahel with around up to 1,000 personnel there. And regular military training exercises, such as the one you just mentioned, African Lion, where they've worked with African armies to train troops on specific aspects, for example, the counterterrorism operations or whatever. But there's a wider dimension, which is that until now, the US has always made a very strong signal, if you like, of its support for Africa more generally, through the development agencies, USAID and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, through a strong diplomatic engagement, big embassies, a strong tradition in the US State Department of diplomats with real knowledge of the region. And this has been bipartisan. So it's been not just Democrat presidents with their traditional appeal, if you like, to the African-American electorate, but it's also been true with the Republicans. For example, George W. Bush with the PEPFAR initiative for crucial health initiative in the early 2000s. So that's been what the US has been doing up to now, but now we're seeing a change.
Yeah, we are seeing this worrying shift. Let's focus on the timing of all of this. As I said before, Islamist insurgency is expanding across the continent. You also have China launching training programs for African militaries, while Russian mercenaries are also trying to cement their role in Africa's security. Is this really the right time for the US to start to pull back, do you think?
Well, it feels like a very strange time because the Trump administration has made no secret of its concern about China's growing influence, growing power. And as you mentioned, the Chinese have launched a military training program in Africa, and that, of course, is complemented by their huge economic presence, both through the financing of major projects, bridges, railways, pipelines, and of course in the Chinese state system, very often projects that a Western company might find difficult to do, Chinese enterprises can do, but also through a growing Chinese small business presence, and now also complemented by this security presence. And the Chinese have a very active diplomacy. In September last year, there was the latest of the big regular Africa-China summits in Beijing, attracting very many of the continent's heads of state. And now we're also seeing Russia with mercenaries and with security companies under the control of the Kremlin, particularly present, again, in the Sahel countries, in Niger, in Mali, Burkina Faso, but also in the Central African Republic and elsewhere. I mean, the Russian presence, the Russian offer is mostly security plus mining. The Chinese offer is a much broader one. But in both cases, these are big global players reinforcing their presence. So it seems a very strange time for the US to rein back and to say that it's expecting African militaries to become more self-sufficient, particularly because some of the countries under most pressure are in some of the poorest parts of the continent. So it's a very strange decision.
And do we have any response from African officials? Have they responded to this news that the US could be pulling back and scaling back their presence?
They haven't really said very much at this stage, but it's quite an interesting contrast that just at this moment the European Union has been stepping up its diplomatic overtures. Of course, the EU has a long-term strong involvement with Africa, but the EU's sales pitch, as it's like, if you like, the message that the EU is saying very explicitly is we're the reliable partner. So without making any comments about the US, the implication is that the US is becoming a country that can't quite be relied on. Now, African leaders, of course, will be very cautious about saying anything because there are still other important factors at stake. The US, of course, is a major voice in institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the UN, which are still so important for Africa. And there's a particular economic issue, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. This, again, is another of those bipartisan measures. It was designed to try and help African countries export goods into the US and therefore thus help their development, their job creation. With the Trump administration's much more nationalistic trade policy, that already looks very vulnerable. And countries such as Lesotho, in southern Africa, some of the poorest countries, risk being very badly affected. Madagascar is another country where huge numbers of jobs could be at risk. And so African countries will be reluctant to say anything critical in public. We've just seen the South African president have a really quite awkward diplomatic encounter with President Trump a few days ago in the White House, and they won't want to do anything that destabilizes those bits of the US relationship that are useful and positive, and that they think they can still conserve, and engagement that they can still keep. And for particularly AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, that's a really important factor in maintaining trade. And so they'll be very anxious not to offend the US, despite their private concerns perhaps about these defense and military issues.
Yeah, it's a hard balancing act that they're going to have to play there. Paul, really great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us on Eye on Africa today.